program with a personality. Every catastrophe in this story starts the same way, not with malice but with curiosity. Nobody who built the first computer virus, or the second, or even the fourth, set out to break anything. They were testing an idea, playing a prank on a friend, or trying to answer a question nobody had thought to ask yet. Can a piece of software move on its own? The answer turned out to be yes. And the 50 years since that answer arrived have produced an industry worth hundreds of billions of dollars, built entirely around containing a genie that a handful of curious, mostly harmless people let out of the bottle one experiment at a time. You're watching the series where we take apart the small pieces of technology that quietly rearrange the world, and today's piece isn't hardware at all. It's an idea, self-replicating code, and the story of how that idea escaped the laboratory is stranger, funnier, and more human than almost anyone expects. If that's the kind of history you're here for, subscribe, because we're not done digging. A mathematician's idea, before anyone had a network to run it on. The theoretical groundwork for everything in this story was laid down before a single virus existed, by a mathematician who never wrote one line of malicious code in his life. In the 1940s and into the 1950s, John von Neumann, one of the towering figures of 20th century mathematics, became fascinated by a strange question. Could you design a machine, purely on paper, capable of building a copy of itself? Von Neumann worked out the logic of self-replicating automata in rigorous mathematical detail, years before any computer existed that could actually run such a thing. It was pure theory, the kind of idea that sits in a drawer for a generation waiting for the technology to catch up to it. In this case, the technology took about 2 decades. The experiment that wasn't trying to prove anything bad. By 1971, that technology had arrived in a limited, almost quaint form. ARPANET, the U.S. Defense Department-funded network connecting a few dozen research computers at universities and government labs across the country. It was small enough that everyone on it more or less knew everyone else, and it was built, quite deliberately, on trust rather than security. Nobody had designed defenses against an attack from inside, because nobody inside had any reason to attack. An engineer at a company called BBN Technologies, Bob Thomas, decided to test von Neumann's old theoretical question against real hardware. He wrote a program, running on PDP-10 mainframes under an operating system called TENEX, that could move itself from one machine to another across the network. He called it Creeper. When it landed on a new system, it displayed a single, slightly theatrical line of text. I am the Creeper. Catch me if you can. It didn't delete files. It didn't steal anything. It was, by every account that survives, an entirely benign experiment in a question that had never been tested outside of mathematics. Can code travel on its own? It could. Administrators at academic computing centers found Creeper mildly alarming and genuinely annoying. Logs from Stanford's system describe it eating up to a quarter of the machine's processing cycles during one particularly bad morning. But nobody lost data, and nobody was harmed. Creeper simply proved the theory correct, out in the wild for the first time. Email's inventor builds the first antivirus. Here's a detail that almost never makes it into the popular version of this story, and it deserves better billing than a footnote. The engineer who took Creeper to the next level, building an enhanced version that could actually replicate itself rather than just relocate, was Bob Thomas's colleague at BBN, a man named Ray Tomlinson. If that name sounds familiar for a completely different reason, it should. Tomlinson is the same person credited with inventing email as we know it, and specifically with the decision to use the @ symbol to separate a username from a machine address, a convention that has now outlived nearly every other design decision from that era of computing. Tomlinson didn't stop at improving Creeper. In 1972, he wrote a second program called Reaper, designed to move through ARPANET hunting down and deleting every copy of Creeper it could find. Reaper is, by the consensus of computer historians, the first antivirus software ever written, meaning the exact same person who gave the world a foundational piece of how we communicate online also gave it, almost as an afterthought, the first tool built specifically to hunt down self-replicating code. The offense and the defense, invented back-to-back, by the same guy. A 15-year-old's winter break prank. For the next decade, self-replicating programs stayed almost entirely inside research institutions, interesting to computer scientists, invisible to everyone else. That changed in 1982, and it changed because of a 15-year-old high school student in Mount Lebanon, Pennsylvania, named Rich Skrenta. Skrenta had a reputation among his friends for tampering with the floppy disks he shared, modifying pirated games with little jokes and pranks, until enough of his friends got wise and started refusing to accept disks from him at all. During winter break, working alone, he wrote something more ambitious, a program that would attach itself to the Apple II operating system and spread automatically, without him having to hand anyone a doctored disk directly. He called it Elk Cloner. It was a boot sector virus, meaning it lived in the small section of a floppy disk that a computer reads first when starting up, and every time someone booted an infected disk on a machine and then inserted a clean disk into the same drive, Elk Cloner quietly copied itself onto the new one too. Given how casually floppy disks were shared among friends and classmates in 1982, with essentially zero awareness that such a thing as a virus could even exist, Elk Cloner spread through Skrenta's social circle with remarkable efficiency. Every 50th boot, instead of loading normally, an infected machine would clear its screen and display a poem, written by Skrenta himself. Elk Cloner, the program with a personality it will get on all your disks, it will infiltrate your chips, yes, it's Cloner. It will stick to you like glue, it will modify RAM to send in the cloner. It's worth sitting with what this actually represents. Creeper, a decade earlier, had been a serious engineer's controlled experiment inside a trusted research network. Elk Cloner was a bored teenager's practical joke, written over a school break, that became, almost by consensus among historians of computing, the first virus to spread genuinely in the wild, outside any laboratory, on real machines belonging to real people who had no idea what was happening to them. Skrenta went on to graduate from Northwestern with a computer science degree and had an entirely ordinary career in the tech industry. The prank he wrote as a teenager outlived his own memory of it as a footnote. It's now taught in cybersecurity courses as the moment personal computing lost its innocence. The brothers who signed their own virus. 4 years later, on the other side of the planet, two brothers in Lahore, Pakistan, wrote something with a motive far more specific than a prank. Basit and Amjad Farooq Alvi, 17 and 24 years old, ran a small computer shop selling both original and pirated software, Lotus 123, WordStar, whatever customers wanted. What frustrated them wasn't strangers stealing their work. It was watching their own customers walk out with a legitimate copy and then quietly duplicate it for their friends without paying for it again. Their response was a boot sector virus they named Brain, and it became the first virus known to infect IBM-compatible personal computers running MS-DOS, the operating system that, at the time, was rapidly becoming the standard for business computers around the world. What makes Brain genuinely strange by the standards of anything that came after it is what the brothers put inside the code. Their actual names, their real street address in Lahore, and their actual phone numbers, along with a message reading, "Welcome to the dungeon," an invitation for anyone infected to call them for a vaccination. They weren't hiding. They considered Brain a friendly virus, a wake-up call rather than an attack. And they were candid enough about their own identity that when the virus eventually reached students at the University of Delaware and made international news, tracking down its authors took a single overseas phone call. One of the people fascinated by Brain's code was a software engineer named John McAfee, who studied it, wrote a program to detect and remove it, and posted that program to an early electronic bulletin board. Within 2 weeks, he had 1 million users. That program became the seed of McAfee Associates, meaning one of the largest commercial antivirus companies in history exists, in a very direct sense, because 2 brothers in Lahore got tired of software piracy and decided to write code that could track it. The Alvi brothers, for their part, never went into cybercrime. Their company eventually became one of Pakistan's largest internet service providers. The night the internet actually broke. Everything up to this point, Creeper, Elk Cloner, Brain, had been mischievous, experimental, or at worst mildly disruptive. Nobody had yet managed to genuinely break the internet. That changed on the night of November 2nd, 1988, and the person responsible didn't intend to break anything either, which is precisely what makes this story the most instructive one in the entire history of computer security. Robert Tappan Morris was 23 years old, a first-semester graduate student in computer science at Cornell University, fresh off an undergraduate degree from Harvard. There's a detail about his family that adds a layer of irony almost too perfect to be real. His father, also named Robert Morris, was at that time the chief scientist at the National Security Agency's National Computer Security Center. In other words, one of the country's senior authorities on exactly the kind of computer security failure his son was about to cause. By his own later account, Morris built a program with a specific, curious, and entirely non-malicious goal: to estimate the actual size of the internet, which at the time consisted of roughly 60,000 connected machines, mostly at universities, government labs, and research institutions. To disguise where the program had originated, he logged into a computer at MIT rather than releasing it from his own account at Cornell, and set it loose at around 8:30 in the evening. Within hours, it was clear something had gone catastrophically wrong. A coding flaw meant the program didn't check reliably enough whether a machine was already infected before infecting it again. So instead of spreading once per computer and quietly counting, it multiplied uncontrollably, filling up memory and processing capacity until infected machines slowed to a crawl or stopped responding entirely. By the following morning, an estimated 6,000 of the roughly 60,000 computers connected to the internet, about 10% of the entire network on Earth, had been brought down. A panicked student at Berkeley emailed colleagues that night, "We are currently under attack." Morris, realizing what was happening, tried to send an anonymous message with instructions for how to stop the program from spreading further. The network was so clogged by that point that the message itself couldn't get through. The first conviction, and an unlikely second act. 2 years earlier, in 1986, the United States Congress had passed the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, a law that had never yet been used to prosecute anyone, because nothing on the scale of what Morris had just done had ever happened before. Morris was indicted in 1989 and convicted by a jury in 1990, the first felony conviction in American history under that law. His sentence reflected the court's judgment that he genuinely hadn't intended the damage his program caused. 3 years of probation, 400 hours of community service, and a fine of just over $10,000. No prison time. The incident directly led the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency to fund the creation of the first Computer Emergency Response Team, an organization built specifically to coordinate the kind of rapid, cross-institution response that the Morris worm had shown the internet completely lacked. Cybersecurity, as an organized discipline with dedicated institutions rather than individual engineers reacting ad hoc, effectively begins here. And then, in one of the more remarkable second acts in the history of technology, Robert Tappan Morris didn't disappear into disgrace. He went on to co-found a company called ViaWeb with a young programmer named Paul Graham, a company that was later acquired by Yahoo and became Yahoo Store. He earned tenure as a professor at MIT in the same institution whose computers he'd once used to anonymously launch a worm that crashed a tenth of the internet. And he became one of the founding partners of Y Combinator, the startup accelerator that has since helped launch companies including Airbnb, Dropbox, and Stripe. The first person ever convicted of a federal computer crime in the United States is now one of the more quietly influential figures in the entire history of Silicon Valley. What this actually tells us. Step back across all four of these stories, and a pattern emerges that's easy to miss if you look at each one in isolation. Creeper was a legitimate research question. Elk Cloner was a teenager's prank. Brain was an anti-piracy statement, signed with the author's real names and phone numbers. The Morris worm was, by its own creator's account, an attempt to measure something, sabotaged by a bug rather than by intent. Not one of the four foundational moments in the history of computer viruses was built by someone trying to cause the kind of damage that followed. The damage, every single time, came from the gap between what the code was supposed to do and what it actually did once it was loose in a system too complex and too trusting to contain it. That gap between intention and consequence, between a clever idea and an environment built without any real defense against it, is the entire reason a multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity industry exists today. It didn't start with criminals. It started with curiosity, with pranks, with grievances over unpaid software, and with a graduate student who just wanted to count how big the internet actually was. 50 years later, we're still building the locks nobody thought we'd need, for a house that a few curious people, almost entirely by accident, taught the rest of us could be broken into in the first place.